How's it going, everybody? This is Andre here with the Kevin Breeze channel, and this is pros and cons for the OnePlus Nord N100. This phone was just released in November of 2020, and today I'm going to be going over some good and bad things about the device. Let's get started. So the first pro for this phone is the storage. This phone has 64 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. And for a phone of this level, this is definitely a good amount of storage. Comparably, a lot of the phones in a similar price range to this one only have 32 gigabytes of internal storage. And with apps being bigger and bigger these days, not to mention the system also taking up a lot of storage itself, the bare minimum really is going to take up a lot of space on the phone as it is, and because of that, 32 gigabytes really isn't cutting it anymore. So having 64 definitely makes a huge difference. And to put this into perspective, the entry-level iPhone, which is a lot more expensive than this phone to begin with, starts out at 64 gigabytes of internal storage itself, and those phones don't have the option to expand the storage with microSD card. So storage-wise, you're getting more of an advantage with this phone already. Of course, if you do have a lot of photos and videos and that sort of thing that take up a lot of space on your phone, you can definitely use a microSD card with this phone to expand the storage even more. To give you an idea of what all of this looks like, right now we have the system right here taking up 16 gigabytes of space on the phone, and we have all the apps that you might use on a daily basis, and that's taking up 2.9 gigabytes of storage on the phone, and other files taking up 1.3, which is not a small amount either. In total, that's taking up 20.13 gigabytes on this phone, and that's only 31% of the storage being used. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of space available for you to use for other things. And imagine if this was only 32 gigabytes. That would be almost all of the storage. Whereas now, you have plenty of room for other things like apps and photos and videos and other things that take up a lot of space. Even if you use larger apps like games and that sort of thing, you're gonna have the space for it on this phone. Now, my first con for this phone is that it doesn't have NFC. NFC is the technology required for Google Pay. These days, a touchless option for payments like Google Pay, Samsung Pay, Apple Pay, you name it, they're all getting more and more widely used and accepted, and it's a really convenient way to make a payment without having to use your wallet. But without NFC, you're not even able to use that feature, so it's really something that with this phone, you're gonna be missing out on, which I think is a really big disappointment because it's something a lot of people find useful. Now, my next pro for this phone is that it has a large battery. This phone has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery that supports 18 watt fast charging. Now that's a huge battery that's going to give you a lot of life and longevity. Not only is a charge on this phone going to last for a really long time, but it's also going to degrade slower. So over time, batteries do degrade, all of them do, but with a larger battery, especially one as large as this one, so you're going to get a lot more longevity out of this phone than you would with a phone that has, say, a 3,000 milliamp hour battery. In addition to this, it also supports 18 watt fast charging, so if you do have a fast charger, you're really going to be able to take advantage of this. Say you're in a situation like you're at the office or something and your phone's dying, then you can easily plug it in and get it charged to full power a lot faster. My next con for this phone is that it has no dust and water resistance. Now, for more entry-level phones, this is more of an expected thing, but nowadays you would think that they would make the phones at least a little bit resistant to dust and water, because no matter what your situation is, you're bound to have a moment every now and then where your phone is exposed to something like excessive dust, or if it rains a lot, whatever the situation might be. It's nice to know that your phone has a little bit of extra resistance to that, and unfortunately this phone doesn't. Now, my next pro for this phone is that it has a large screen with a 90Hz display. This phone has a 6.52-inch IPS LCD display that is actually a 90Hz display. And a 90Hz display is definitely on the more uncommon side for a phone like this that's more entry level. This is going to make the display a lot smoother, and it's gonna look a lot nicer. Not only that, but the screen is definitely a decently large size, and with a screen to body ratio of 82.9%, the bezels are really thin, giving it a nice modern look. That accompanied by a hole punch front-facing camera, which I really like the style of a lot. Not only are you gonna have a nice sleek modern look, but the screen is very large, so when you're doing something like content consumption, or even if you're reading something on the web, you're gonna be able to see everything a lot better, a lot more clearly, and it's gonna be overall a better experience. Now that being said, that does bring me to my next con for the phone, which is the display itself has a resolution of only 720p. Now, that's not to say that it makes the display look bad in itself, but I do think they could have done a little bit better on this. One of the big problems I have with the fact that the display on this phone is 720p is that it can shoot video in 1080p. So when you shoot those videos, even though they're being shot in 1080p, you're not gonna actually be able to view them in that resolution. You're only gonna be viewing them in 720p because that's the display of the screen itself. Now, I think that's a little bit inconvenient and disappointing because personally, if I'm shooting something in a quality of 1080p, I would like to see it in 1080p instead of having to put it on a computer or another device in order to see it in its full quality. Now, I do recognize that a lot of these other higher end phones can shoot video in 4K, and obviously they don't all have 4K displays. But for a quality as standard as 1080p, I really don't think that it's that much to ask for a 1080p display, especially considering that this phone has a 90 Hz display as well, which is pretty uncommon for a phone of this level. I think it would have made the picture even better to have it in 1080p. And I think it would have made a huge difference. Now, my next pro for this phone is that it has a headphone jack. This might sound like a little thing, but these days, more and more manufacturers are doing away with their headphone jacks, even on the mid to lower end phones. And this phone actually does have a headphone jack right here. Now, of course, wireless speakers and headphones are getting more and more common these days, but it's always nice to have the option to use a normal pair of wired 3.5mm headphones if you choose to do so. And unlike so many new phones, this phone actually does give you the option, so that's really great to see. Now, my next con for this phone is in the camera setup. This phone has a 13 megapixel rear camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, and an 8 megapixel front facing camera. Now, this is not a bad setup in and of itself, but you'll notice the ultra-wide camera is missing, and I am a little disappointed that this phone doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. That's a feature that's becoming more and more common these days, and it's a little bit of an expectation, really, that a phone, especially one with such nice features as this one, would have an ultra-wide camera, and it unfortunately doesn't. It is nice that it has a macro camera, but at the same time, I would want it to have an ultra-wide camera too. And I personally think that in most situations, an ultra-wide camera is actually more useful than a macro camera anyway, because with a macro camera, you're really just zooming in super close to an object. And I feel like an ultra-wide camera has more applicable uses. You could use it for group photos, or if you're taking a picture of a large object or room and want to get the whole thing. There's so many different uses for it, whereas a macro camera really has only one use. So if I were to choose between the two, I would definitely choose the ultra-wide camera every time. And unfortunately, this one only has a macro camera, so that is a disappointment. Now, my final pro for this phone is the processor. This phone has 4 GB of RAM with a Qualcomm Snapdragon 460 processor. We ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 251 and a multi-core score of 1172. Now, these are really good numbers for a phone of this level. This is really only an entry-level phone, but it has the processing power to do a lot more than the average entry-level phone. To put this into perspective, I've seen phones in a similar price range that have almost 50% less power in their multi-core score than this phone. With this phone, not only are you going to be able to do your basic activities like sending text messages and making calls and browsing the web and that sort of thing better, but having a faster processor is going to give you a better experience with content creation, stuff like social media, things like photo and video editing, and even playing games. That's a really big one. A lot of the phones in this entry level aren't really even able to do gaming that much. But with this phone, you're going to be able to do a lot more than other phones in the price range because of this processing power. Now, my final con for this phone is that there's no wireless charging. Now, this is not really that unusual for this price range. Wireless charging is usually a feature that's reserved for more flagship phones and higher end phones, but I have seen some phones around the entry level that do have wireless charging, and I'm not sure why more don't, because wireless charging is a really nice, convenient feature, and it's a good alternative if, say, something happens to your charging port, or if you're using the charging port for something else and you just need to plug your phone in. It's a really good alternative in those situations and many more. So I really wish that this phone and other phones that aren't flagship phones or super high-end phones had wireless charging. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video of pros and cons for the OnePlus Nord N100. If you did, definitely leave a thumbs up and subscribe. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video.